Thank you to Hannah Burling from Fair Districts, New Mexico, and Leonard Gorman from the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission. You can watch Gwyneth's entire interview right now on the New Mexico in Focus YouTube page. Now, earlier this month, the Biden administration publicly announced its decision to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. 20 countries have banned these types of weapons, though neither the U.S., Russia, or Ukraine have ratified that convention. For 2 decades, New Mexico journalists Karen Coates and Jerry Redfern have documented the long-term human and environmental impacts of Vietnam-era cluster bomb campaigns in Cambodia and Laos, including in their film Eternal Harvest. Now get this, the U.S. military dropped 4 billion pounds of explosives in Southeast Asia between 1964 and 1973. About 30% of those bombs didn't detonate, and they still remain a threat to people today. The filmmakers joined Laura Paskus in our Albuquerque studios to talk about what makes these bombs so dangerous for so long.
Karen Coates, Jerry Redfern, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
So when you heard that President Biden approved sending cluster bombs to Ukraine, what was your initial reaction?
Here we go again. I had other thoughts too that I probably shouldn't say on public TV.
Right. So cluster bombs are banned by many countries by a convention that was adopted in 2010, and even Congress has placed some restrictions on cluster bombs. Jerry, can you talk about why they're so bad?
Well, the reason they're really bad is like their very basic general nature. So a cluster bomb is actually like a big bomb with a bunch of tiny little bombs inside of it. And then when you drop it, the big bomb opens up and shoots all the tiny little bombs out. Like, for example, a size of something like this. This is half of a cluster munition that was dropped over Laos probably 55 years ago. So you'll have maybe 600 of these inside a much larger bomb, cracks open in the air, scatters these over the course of 2 or 3 football fields, and exploding all over the place, or not, depending. I mean, the cluster munitions that were made and that have been made and that were made until recently have all sorts of different purposes. You know, anti-personnel, to try to kill people, to try to penetrate through armor, or to actually, like this one did, it would send out tripwires to act as a landmine, so that if somebody was walking nearby it, they'd trip over the wire and it would explode. So there are all sorts of reasons. The big problem with them is that you're throwing so many out there that you inevitably have a failure rate. And if you're throwing out hundreds at a time or thousands at a time, or in the case of Laos, Vietnam, hundreds of millions at a time, those failure rates add up. And then you're left with millions of these things in the ground years afterward that are found by farmers or kids, and it kills them. It kills them.
So the United States has millions of these bombs in storage. And before we dive into your reporting on Laos and Cambodia, I just wanted to ask, who builds and sells and profits off of these bombs?
Well, just to clarify, as far as we know, as is reported, the United States is no longer manufacturing cluster munitions. There had been an effort for quite a few years to try to come up with a so-called better cluster munition with a lower failure rate below 1%. No one has ever been able to achieve that. And so I think it was in 2016 when the last company who was making them pulled out and said, we can't do this anymore. However, there's still desire to come up with something better.
I was surprised because in a recent Washington Post story, it said, although the United States has used cluster munitions in every major war since Korea, no new ones are believed to have been produced for years. So we don't actually know if somebody's making them, or...
Again, just to clarify, that isn't the focus area of our reporting, but as far as the research I have done, I have not come across anybody who today is making them in this country. Okay. However, they are being manufactured in other countries.
Okay. So you've reported on the impacts of cluster bombs in Cambodia and Laos for about 20 years. I was wondering, on the ground, what did you learn? What are some of the stories that you've heard, the human impacts that you've seen there?
We had been living and working in Southeast Asia for quite some time, but it was in 2005, going way back to then, We were working on an archaeology story. There's a large area called the Plain of Jars, full of these massive ancient stone jars. That area during the war was heavily bombed. And so today, and at that time, archaeologists and anybody studying the jars had to go with a clearance group, a bomb clearance group, to make sure that the area was safe. Many of the jars had been destroyed or damaged in the bombings. And in the course of reporting this story, we were in that area for about 2.5, 3 weeks, and we heard of more than 20 accidents with cluster munitions just around that area. So we kind of looked at each other and said, we need to do something more on this. And we met a 10-year-old boy named Beek who was in the hospital just a few days before. He'd been out working in his field, and he hit something and it blew up and caused, major damage to his belly and his face. And that was sort of what really motivated us to look into this deeper. And over many years then we encountered, I don't know how many stories like that.
So these were bombs that were dropped in the 60s and 70s, is that right? And so I'm imagining that there were terrible impacts at that time, but now decades and decades later, still?
Yeah, so the bombs don't necessarily stop working. And I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer to call them duds. I mean, they just haven't gone off, right? But they're still, in most cases, completely capable of going off at this point. And that's really the big issue. So they found that what happened a lot of times, particularly in Southeast Asia, you have a monsoon season, for example, and if you're bombing during the monsoon season when the ground is essentially jello, the bombs will sink into the ground during that season instead of detonating like they were supposed to. And then they can churn. It's a term called turbation, how the soils churn all on their own between seasons and such. So things that can be dropped in one place, they fall, you drop a bomb here, it doesn't detonate, it can churn through the ground, pop up somewhere else. And these sort of dangers just, keep on moving through fields year after year, decade after decade. And these things still happen. They still find things in Laos today, and Cambodia, and Vietnam.
So it sounds like there's obviously impacts on individual people and families and communities. What about the governments? How are they handling having to deal with this US-caused problem all these decades later?
In Southeast Asia, in Laos in particular, that's a really difficult question to answer, and it's a tricky question because there are so many complicating factors about the Lao government, which is a communist government.
So the United States actually does shell out a great deal of money. Well, they say they shell out a great deal of money. They call it a great deal of money every year to help these countries clear up bombs there in Laos, in Cambodia, in Vietnam. The idea, though, they've been doing this has been going on since the early 90s. So that's 30 years. We're still paying millions upon millions of dollars a year to help clean up this issue. They're still finding bombs. The governments do want to work to get rid of these problems to a greater or lesser extent. I think for the most part, they all really want to get rid of it. But for an economy like Laos, which is very much a lower developing economy, they also, I think, often don't want to scare off investors. So they don't talk about it as much as Vietnam does, or as much as Cambodia does, because they don't want to scare people from showing up and doing things that Laos has space and money to do, like mining or forestry and such, which are dangerous if you don't work with clearance teams.
Right. In a 2016 story, Karen, you wrote, "The craters are not just vestiges of war, they're geographic testaments to the anthropogenic force of bombs. Research shows that when a bomb bursts, it alters long-term soil formation, vegetation growth, and hydrology. It also affects how people use the land in the future. It's a phenomenon so disruptive that it's given rise to a new field of science with an evocative name, bomb turbation." Can we talk about those environmental impacts?
Yeah, and Jerry had talked a bit about this already. Anytime you have an explosion, it's going to turbate the soil, the sediments, the rock, whatever is in the environment. when you have multiple explosions in a place, which is exactly what happens with cluster munitions, you have, bomb, 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 there's an even greater effect. So in places in Laos, for example, as we have seen, there are still large craters and small craters all over the countryside, to the point where 50 years later, they're deep enough, they're prominent enough that people use them as ponds. They use them for fish. Buffalo will sort of wallow in the water in there. The changes in the landscape are not necessarily good or bad, but what happens is that anytime you have explosions like that on a battlefield, it does alter the landscape. It means that certain things might not grow there in the future that had in the past. It can change the vegetation, the soil structure, as I was saying. So it is, there's a definite human-caused change to the environment and the way that people perceive the land as well. And another big thing about that, and a similarity between, say, Ukraine today and Laos, both are very heavily, they're farming communities, farming areas. And so if you're a farmer and your land has been bombed, your land has been covered with cluster munitions, the way you see that land is going to completely change, because you are then afraid to go out anywhere. Even if there's just one that didn't go off, you don't know where it is, so you can't use it safely.
Yeah. So I know you don't want to speak for the people of Laos or Cambodia by any means, but in your experience of interviewing people, what do you think that the people of Laos and Cambodia might want Americans and Russians and Ukrainians to really understand about using these bombs and really embracing their use in this war?
I think they'd be horrified. I think they'd be absolutely horrified. I don't think anybody we've ever met has been anything but absolutely crushed by having come in contact with these things. I mean, emotionally and then physically as well. A key thing to remember, sometimes people conflate landmines with cluster munitions, and they're actually quite different. There was a cover story in the New York Times this past weekend talking about landmines in Ukraine, and the key part about most of that is that a landmine is designed to injure a soldier, so that 2 other soldiers have to come onto the field and take that person off. So you actually get 3 for 1 that are taken off the field. These cluster munitions, like this originally, which is now a lamp, these things were designed to kill. So when people find them in the ground, generally speaking, they don't survive. I mean, this is an incredible danger, right? And they're small and they bury. And when these things are in the ground, you can barely see that they're there. They look like rocks. Or if you find one like this in a tree, it looks like a toy to a kid. So they're a totally different animal. They're small, they're hard to find, and they're meant to be completely and utterly deadly.
Well, thank you both for your reporting and talking with me about all of this today. It's an important and frustrating story, so thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Laura.